Hello, I'm Mauricio Baros, and I'm going to present the paper Queer Orientation, the Architecture of the Orientalist. Queer as a concept began with issues related to gender, but its contemporary conceptualization, it has begun to encompass various fields, including geography and space. For our purpose, queer has two characteristics that are fundamental for our study cases. We shall to consider within his definition the homosexual tendencies that were common to the three cases studied, Frederick Layton, Pierre Loti, and Robert Gallen Anderson, and to constitute a liminal space, a space of vagueness, where it is sometimes possible to locate what has no place in any other cartography. Due to the limited length rather than a detailed examination of each case study, we want to focus on aspects common to all three and treat them in a more transversal way. Liminal territories. Liminal territories have always existed, but in this example, they were created by the colonial system itself. Imperialism created new frontiers, both physical and symbolic. Among these, the Mediterranean was undoubtedly the liminal space par excellence, where Europe met Asia and Africa. For this reason, it became a meeting place, but also a place of escape and escapism for many Europeans in search of something more than exploration. Mediterranean liminalism is evidenced by the fact that for many European travelers, the symbolic order of the East began within Europe itself, for whom countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain were as exotic and dissolute as the countries of the Middle East and Africa. There were two agendas for these travelers, an official one under which they traveled with the aim of carrying out geographical explorations, archaeological surveys, ethnographic studies, etc., and a personal one, which was dictated more by interest and whims. It is this last agenda that we wish to consider in this article. The Orientalism must sin and escapism to the East. The writers and artists who live in the Mediterranean created and perpetuate the myth of the homoerotic South, a fusion of ancient and modern images. Byron, Lawrence, Barton, Flaubert, etc., created the myth of a Mediterranean and a homoerotic Orient. They installed the mise-en-scene for latent European travelers. The prestige gave them a certain license that not all Orientalists have. For them, the pretext of a cultural trip turned their journey into a personal quest. It was Richard Barton who defined this area as a zootic zone. This zone includes meridional France, the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and Greece, with the coast region of Africa from Morocco to Egypt. This vast liminal space was perfect for those who were in search of an escape from the strict moral norm of their own countries. Orientalism, as is well known, used various means to assert European superiority over the Eastern regions. This was precisely the main purpose of journeying to the East, to map the East as a political affiliation and other times in a symbolic or imaginary way. While those who traveled for institutional purpose had to procure a series of daily coded products, histories, cartographies, archaeological and photographic surveys, etc., the private journey was reflected in personal notebooks and logs, which recorded many of the experiences of these travelers, which were disseminated mainly through literary fictions, in the case of Loti and Gallen Anderson, or pictorial, in the case of Frederick Layton and Frederick Lewis. And it is through this work that an intimate profile of the personal life of these characters had been constructed. These Mediterranean or Eastern escapades become spaces where the subject could do what in Spanish is called divertirse, to have fun, from the Latin root vertere, to turn around, to become an other, something that somehow happened to most Orientalists after visiting the East. The Orient allowed them to create a second identity that they somehow never left. Here too, this character could give free rein to their hidden sexual desires and longings, disguised by Oriental clothing. Many of these travelers were particularly attracted to young men whom they associated with the ancient Ephesus, made fashionable by the Neo-Hellenism of the time. Thus, many of them look for a helper or assistant to take the place of the Hellenic Eromenos, the subject under the direction of an older man, Erastes. Thus, we find Pirlotti Samuel, Guyon Anderson Abdul, and Frederick Leighton Henry Greville. For a long time, the fib was a frequent theme among these writers, who included it in their literary fiction, as in the case of Thomas Manns, or pictorially, as in the case of Frederick Leighton, and photographically, as in the case of the controversial William Gledden. Through fiction, the hidden homosexual desires and longing of their author were revealed, who sublimated through their work the forbidden love they felt for these ephebs. The boundary between this Socratic love and physical love sometimes seem quite blurred, as in the example of Winkelmann, one of the greatest promoters of Hellenism, but who seemed to place physical beauty above spiritual beauty. The ambiguity and liminality offered this sotatic zone, in Burton's words, allowed these travelers to forge a second identity, to become the other they so desire. In this case, reversing the colonialist stance common in Orientalism. This Mediterranean transformism needed a platform on which to manifest itself, and this was the trigger for the need to construct another refuge for it. Liminal architecture. Just as there are liminal territories, there are also liminal spatialities, and it is under this conceptualization that most of the Orientalist residents can be understood, especially the three cases studied. In the case of Pirlotti, not only does his literary production have a strong Orientalist character, but his own residence in Rochefort is also a completely eclectic synthesis of the various facets of Orientalism, ranging from Arabic room to Chinese room to Japanese room and so on. In the case of Frederick Leighton, in London, part of this pictorial production takes on Orientalist feature, but it's above all the collection of Orientalist objects and the construction of the Arab Hall in his residence that allow him to be positioned as such. And finally, and lesser known, is the figure of the English colonel Robert Guyon Anderson, who acquired a house in Cairo on loan in order to live there and live a life all'orientale. The cases were chosen because the three subjects share homosexual tendencies, ranging from latent homosexual sublimation, Loti bisexualism, and Guyon Anderson's more questionable pederasty. The fact that this house still exists and can be visited also contributed to the choice of cases. The ease of Orientalism is an ease constructed for those who have dreamed it, imagined it, visit, and live in it. It is above all a personal Orient, which is why we cannot speak of a single East, but of a personal East. Although not all Orientalists were homosexual, many used the Orient as a medium to express and manifest their repressed sexuality. To this end, Orientalists had constructed a series of devices that began in literature, in travel diaries, and were later transferred to painting and then materialized in architecture. The café, hammam, garden, etc., appear within these devices. All these spaces have been characterized as liminal spaces that facilitate homosocial and also homosexual encounters, as in the case of hammam. They are also places where the boundaries between the self and other are blurred. But what happened at the level of public space was also replicated in private space, particularly in private home, which in this case took on the role of a personal liminal space, and it is in these spaces that Orientalism and queer meet. Queer collecting and aestheticism. It is in this refuge that we will find an aesthetic that we can call queer. One of the characters of this residence is their physical distance, since they were far from their own countries of origins, Guy and Anderson, or functional distance, since they were far from important urban centers in the case of Pirlotti, but above all as stylistic detachments, since the Oriental style placed them in a status closer to a personal whim than to the official architecture. Although the three houses are works that don't display an Orientalist or eclectic character from the outside, their Orientalism is more evident in the interior design. These were places where objects were on display for their own sake, rather than for use, and where a ritualized behavior created a complicated relationship with the space and its objects. Entering such a room, just looking at the object around, would reveal the owner's personality. Collecting was one of the great passions of 19th and 20th century Europe, and it is an element that characterized the three figures. Although many of the species in this museum museums no longer exist, we know for written and graphic evidence that these three figures were enthusiastic collectors, particularly of Oriental objects. This collection was very eclectic, and although it usually included exotic pieces all over the world, it had a strong Oriental accent. Ceramic, carpet, etc. The object played an important role dressing up this interior, transforming them as they were staged into exotic spaces alluding into distant regions. All this undoubtedly gave this space a theatrical aspect, very much in keeping with the activity that took place in them. The aesthetic component of this object was also accentuated by the fact that they were displaying a content different from its origin, which allows some of them to take on a quasi-fetishist character, as in the case of the textiles. Curiously, it was precisely this quality that led collectors to create a very heterogeneous collection of Oriental objects, which, however diverse and varied origins, create an Oriental atmosphere, as it clearly illustrated by each of the rooms in Pierre House. The same was true of Guy and Anderson's house, whose collection of Egyptian objects was of a very different value. The house was therefore a collection of personal objects that form a private and intimate mate of their patients. Objects sometimes seem to be confused between reality and fiction. This was the case, for example, with Pierre Loti and the Tomb of Stel of Asiyade, a character who in his own work seemed to move between the real and the fictional. The author has created a new space in accordance with the destination to which he has recently been traveling, in and about he has been writing. This personal geography, however, sought to establish itself on certain objective basis. This give these interiors a certain degree of veracity. To do this, they have to recourse to original object. For example, Sir Frederick Leighton asked Richard Barton to send him Oriental ceramic from a recently demolished mosque in Damascus, so that he could place them in his Arab room, which in turn was based on an Arab Norman building, the Sisa in Palermo. This collection made it possible to construct what we might call a mise-en-scène for the persona that did subject a contract of their experience of the Orient. The interesting thing about this collecting is that, as Baudrillard points out, the ultimate object of every collector is the person itself. In conclusion, a house of theater. In this way, we can conclude that by stating that these houses were more than just residence. They were personal theaters designed to house their queer identity. A common cliché of late 19th century decadence, and one under which the subject of this study can be clearly categorized, is the resident as a personal theater. They were all decadents in different ways, for there is an intrinsic relationship between Orientalism and decadentism. They all share the ultra refinement, social degeneracy, historical pessimism, and misogyny characteristics of decadence. Although two of them were married, they never managed to have a stable relationship with a woman. Women could be object of fictions in the case of Leighton, or sublimation in the case of Loti, but rarely object of desire. There is obviously a high degree of narcissism to be found among them, for they all saw themselves as artists, and as such as alter deus. That is why they loved not only the male figure, but also themselves. Hence, they introduced in self-portraits. Their villas were nothing more than buildings in which they wanted their own figure to be highlighted. This mention does have three facets: the physical, the building itself; the fictional, the one they construct through their fantasies; and finally, the intimate, the refuge, the place where they could manifest their queer sexuality. The Orient had already been framed by Orientalist literary and pictorial production. This framing, which turned the Orient into a painting, opened the door to the next step, which was to turn the Orient into a model, a stage set, as was already the case with the hundreds of Oriental pavilions that proliferated at the world fairs. This pavilion, as the nickname they were given, folies, were real toys that European society liked to display at this exhibition and in their private domains. The universal exhibitions succeed in fetishizing the Orient, turning it into a stage set and a commodity. The frame image could be now reproduced, multiplied, transported elsewhere, and finally transformed into an object of consumption. In this way, where through a painting, a pottery, a carpet, or a folie in a public or private park, the Orient became accessible and purchasable. As a result, many people feel entitled to create a personal Orient in their homes, fully aware of the sonographic character of this architecture. That is why the Orientalist shelter never turned out being a real home, because they can only be a home for the fictional subject created by their own characters. They are not houses, they are theaters for the spectacle of their own life in a fictional version. The fact is clearly demonstrated by the activity that takes place in them. Lottie houses was usually the scene of theme parties that were publicized and photographed. Leighton House was open to the public at weekends for the exhibition of his work and his own house. And Guy Anderson's house was finally a museum for his collection and for himself. These houses were museums and monuments to themselves, populated with that represent the ideal beauty that they sought and supported for their own image, which reflected in the importance of being portrayed, thus becoming the final object of their own collection. Thank you.